Hello and welcome to Non-Inkables. This will be a little supplement to the comprehensive rules. We're going to go over the glossary, which is at the end of the comprehensive rules, and it's in alphabetical order, so let's get started. The first word is ability. So it is special rules explaining what the card can do that differs from the game rules, such as an effect that resolves as a result of the card being played. So if you remember from the comprehensive rules, the card rules always supersede the game rules. The next word is action, a type of card that gives its player an immediate one-time advantage. When an action is played, its player resolves its effects and puts it in their discard pile. Actions never enter the play zone. So actions cards are either just purely action cards, or they can also be song cards, are a type of action card. So all song cards are actions, but not all actions are songs. And because actions are resolved immediately, they never go into the bag because they're not a triggered ability. So actions, the minute you play them, you have to do all the stuff. The next word is activate, and it means to use an activated ability of a card. I feel like that's kind of like a definition where the word is in the definition. An activated ability is an ability that a player may use after paying its cost. An activated ability can't be used if its cost can't be paid. Activated abilities of items may be used during the turn the item is played. So often it'll be like, oh, you can pay 1 ink and do this. So you can only use it if you can afford to pay the 1 ink. If you can't afford it, then you don't get to use it. Active player is next. Active player is the player who has started their turn. When a player ends their turn, they're no longer the active player. And this is important because when you resolve effects that are in the bag, the active player gets to go first. Altering a starting hand. So an optional choice made at the beginning of the game after each player has drawn their starting hand. Each player may take any number of those cards, so anywhere from 0 to 7, put them on the bottom of their deck without revealing them, draw until they have 7 cards in their hand, and reshuffle their deck. So in Lorcana, it is called altering. In other card games, they will say that it is called mulligan. Bag. So bag is a non-physical zone when triggered abilities wait before determining how their effects resolve. Whenever a triggered ability's condition is met, the ability is added to the bag. So you will normally hear people discussing the bag when there's like a rules issue where people are discussing like if a ruling was correct or something like that. Just remember that the bag is not real. And the only abilities that go in the bag are triggered abilities. So there are other types of abilities like static abilities that don't go in the bag. Actions don't go in the bag. So it's just triggered abilities. The next word is banished, a card that is put into a player's discard pile a card that is put into a player's discard pile after it's banished. A card can be banished as a result of abilities or effects, or if its damage is equal to or greater than its willpower. In other games, they will call this the graveyard, is like the discard pile. And so when they banish a card, they'll say, oh, I'm sending your card to the graveyard, or I am killing your card, essentially. But in Lorcana, we are a family-friendly game, so it is banished. Next word is beginning phase. So the first phase of the turn. When a player resets their cards for the turn, this is where all effects that end at the start of a player's turn end, and where effects that occur or begin at the start of their turn happen. The beginning phase has 3 steps: ready, set, draw. Next is card type. The type that each card used in the game has, such as character, action, item, or location. A card's type determines the rules for how to play it. So currently, those are the only types of cards that we have. Location was added in set 3, but maybe in the future they may add more card types. You never know. Next word is challenge. When a player exerts one of their dry characters and chooses an exerted opposing character or an opposing location, each character deals damage equal to their strength to the other character or the location. So I think this is one where I usually will say like attack, but it's technically challenge. So I'll say like, oh, I'm going to use my Mickey Mouse to attack your whatever. But technically the correct wording is challenge. Next word is challenging character. So a character chosen by the active player to challenge an opposing character or location. A challenging character is considered in a challenge throughout the duration of the challenge. So remember, if you are the active player and you are challenging with your challenging character. If you are not the active player, then your characters are being challenged. So there are a lot of cards that say like if your card has the challenger keyword in a challenge, it has like more strength, right? And then there's some cards that say when you're being challenged, certain things happen. So like maybe like Fred, when you're being challenged and banished, you get 2 lore. Or when being challenged for Enchantress, she gets +2. So she doesn't have Challenger. When she challenges, she's weak. But when she's being challenged, she's stronger. So the challenging character is the one that is the active player's character that's doing the attacking or challenging. Next one is character. And this definition is in blue, which means it's new. A character that has at least one of the classifications listed in 6.1.2.2 on its classification line. So that is like deity or prince or hero or villain, that kind of stuff. There's like a whole list. And then it has both strength and willpower characteristics. A character that is put into the play zone and remains there until it's banished or removed from play by a game effect. A player may have multiple copies of a character with the same name in their deck, but can't have more than 4 copies with the same full name. So remember, the full name consists of the name and the version. So for example, Mickey Mouse is the name, Brave Little Tailor is the version, and so the full name is Mickey Mouse, Brave Little Tailor. Next is classification, a category that identifies some characteristic of the card and may be referenced in the rules of other cards. A card's classification is located to the right of the character's ink type symbol. So examples of classifications would be like Storyborn, Dreamborn, Ally, etc. Next is cost. What is required in order to play a card or use an activated ability? This may be an ink cost or an alternate cost, such as exerting a character. An activated ability can't be used if its full cost can't be paid. Next is damage. Damage on a character or location is represented by damage counters and counts against its willpower. Damage is dealt by characters in a challenge and by some effects. When a card with damage moves from in play to any other zone, the damage ceases to exist. So for example, if you have like a goat in play and it has 2 damage, and then you bounce the goat back to your hand with like a Madam Mim snake. When it goes back to your hand, it no longer has damage. So the next time you play that goat, it has no damage. Damage counter, a counter that is put on a character or location to show how much damage it has. A single damage counter normally represents 1 damage. Any damage counter intended to represent more than 1 damage counts as a separate damage counter for each 1 damage it represents. So for example, if you use a dice, if any effect puts a damage counter onto a character or location, it does not count as damage dealt to the character or location and isn't affected by modifications to damage that is dealt. So if you are putting a damage, specifically if like the effect says put damage, then it doesn't count as dealing damage, so it is not affected by resist. For example, when you move damage, you are taking damage from one character and you are putting it on another character. And so that resist does not affect how much damage you can move. Next one is damaged versus undamaged. A character or location with 1 or more damage is considered damaged. A character or location with no damage is considered undamaged. Next is deck. This part is also in blue. So a set of cards a player uses in the game. The parameters of a deck are defined by the format being played. For example, in Core Constructed, a deck consists of 60 or more cards, up to 2 ink types, and up to 4 cards with the same name and version, together known as the full name, which we already covered. Other formats may have different construction rules. That's like kind of the new part of this definition. There is no upper limit to the number of cards in a deck, and the deck is considered a private zone. Next is discard, and there's both a definition for discard as a noun as well as discard as a verb. So discard as a noun is the single face-up pile where actions are put after they finish resolving and where other cards are put after being banished from play or discarded. When a player puts a card from their hand into their discard, they're discarding that card. The discard is considered a public zone, which means you can look at it, you can count the number of cards at any time. Discard as a verb is when a player chooses 1 or more cards from their hand and puts it into their discard pile. A player can only discard from their hand. And this is relevant particularly emerald, but sometimes also an amber. Those are the two colors that discard. Discard pile is another name for discard. So discard as a noun is also aka discard pile. Discard as a verb is different. Next word is draw. When a player takes the top card of their deck and puts that card into their hand, a player can draw only from their deck. And this is important because there are specific cards that are like when your opponent draws a card, you also get to draw a card. So it's important to know, one, where the card is coming from and if it counts as drawing or not. Draw step is the next one. The third step of the beginning phase of a player's turn, where the player puts the top card of their deck into their hand. Once all effects have been resolved and there are no more waiting to be added, the game moves into the main phase. On the first turn of the game, the active player skips this step. Next word is dry. A character that was in play at the start of a player's current turn is considered to be dry. So in Lorcana, you have to be dry for your character to do stuff, unless it has rush. Drying. A character that was played after the start of a player's current turn is considered to be drying. Drying characters can't quest, challenge, or exert to pay any cost. Non-activated abilities on drying characters, including abilities that trigger when you play this character, are still in effect while the character is drying. Drying characters may still be affected by card effects. So you can't use a drying. So basically you play a character and it is drying, and then your next turn, this character is already played out at the beginning of your next turn, which means it's already dry, and then you can use it to quest, challenge, or exert. But non-activated abilities on drawing characters still affect things. So for example, if you play a Prince John, the green one, that says like when your opponent discards a card, you get to draw a card. Even if he's not dry, that ability still works. But if it was a character where you play and you have to exert it, so say like you play the Yzma that's like a 3/3 and you can exert her to draw 3 cards. When you play her, you can't use her ability because you have to be able to exert her to use that ability. And because she's not dry, she's drying, you can't exert her yet. She's not ready. All right, next word is effect. What happens as a result of a resolving action or ability. Next is end of turn phase, the third phase of the turn structure that begins when the active player declares the end of their turn. And I feel like this comes up mostly with Clarabelle, the big one, the enchanted one, where it's like at the end of your turn you can draw until you have as many cards as the opponent. Exert, so to turn a card sideways, such as to quest, challenge, or pay the cost of a card or ability. Some abilities use the exert symbol, so it's like the hexagon with a little arrow in it, to show that the card must be exerted as part of the ability cost. While a card is exerted, its player may still use abilities that don't require them to exert. So let's use the same Prince John. Let's say you sang a song with Prince John, right? So you exert him to sing like Sudden Chill. So he is exerted. The sudden chill forces your opponent to discard a card, and then Prince John's ability is when your opponent discards a card, you get to draw a card. So even though he's exerted because you've used him, that ability would still trigger and work because you don't have to exert him to use that ability, if that makes sense. Exerted, a card that has been turned sideways. Then there is for free, in quotes, an effect that allows a player to play a card and use an activated ability without having to pay its listed ink cost. A player who plays a card or uses an activated ability for free must still pay any other costs. So it's just for free in terms of ink costs, not for free in terms of all costs. Full name, so for cards that have a version in addition to a name, the combination of the two. So we talked about Mickey Mouse. You could also say like Maui, Hero to All. Maui is its name, Hero to All is the version, and the full name is Maui, Hero to All. Next word is game state check. The check the game performs to verify a set of conditions and the required actions when one or more of the conditions are met. The check occurs at the end of any step, after any action or ability is finished resolving, and after each effect in the bag is finished resolving. For more on this, see part 1.9, Game State Check, and that is in part 1 of the comprehensive review that I did. Next is hand, the zone where cards drawn by a player are held. So technically, it doesn't have to be your actual hand, because technically you could play Lorcana even if you didn't have actual hands, and you could use like a holder, and that would be your hand. We do have a kid that plays with us pretty regularly, and he has this like really cool silicone stand that's like multi-level where he puts his cards, just because I think he has small hands, so it's hard to hold a lot of cards at the same time, and so he uses that. So that silicone thing that he uses would be that holds his hand, even though technically his actual hands are free. Next word is in play, a term used to describe a card that has been put into the play zone. Next is ink, the resource that players use to pay the cost of playing cards and using certain abilities. A player's ink is represented by the cards they put into their inkwell. And people who play other games will sometimes call this mana. Yeah. And then ink type. The ink type of a card is shown by the ink type symbol at the left edge of the card, just above the text box. The 6 ink types are amber, amethyst, emerald, ruby, sapphire, and steel, and each has its own symbol on the cards. A deck can have up to 2 ink types. So technically, you could have a mono color, one color in your deck, although that usually is kind of a weak deck. I have tried. Inkwell, the private zone where a player puts their ink cards face down. Each card in the player's inkwell represents 1 ink, no matter what's on the front of the card. And players can't look at the front of the cards in any inkwell. So private zone, meaning it's private information, nobody can look at it, but you can count how many cards there are. Inkwell symbol is the little swirly sign, a circular symbol that's present around a card's cost. If that card can be put into the player's inkwell and used as ink. So it'll either have like a bare hexagon, which is a card that can't be inked, also known as uninkable or non-inkable, like this channel, or it'll have the swirly, which means it can be inked. The next phrase is damaged, and the definition is dealt damage. So I think this is important in terms of if a card is damaged. I don't even know, because like it's if a card is damaged, that means that card is dealt damage, which means if it has resist, then it affects that. But I don't know if this clarification is, I can't think off the top of my head where this clarification is necessary. Anyways, item is the next word, a card that lists item on its classification line. When a player plays an item, they put it in their play zone where it remains until it's banished or removed from play by a game effect. Items can be exerted during the turn they're played. A player can't have more than 4 copies of an item with the same name in their deck. So when you play an item, usually it comes in ready, and then you can exert it to do its effect. The only exceptions are like things like Greatstone Dragon, that comes in exerted, and it says it on the card, so you can't use it the turn you play it. Next phrase is keyword ability. So an ability or abilities represented by a short bolded name that is the same wherever the ability appears. Example of keyword abilities include bodyguard, challenger, evasive, reckless, rush. And we go through this in part 7 of the comprehensive rules, and it is part of the keyword section, which is section 10 in the comprehensive rules. Next is location, a card that lists location on its classification line. When a player plays a location, they put it in their play zone. Locations have a cost to play, a move cost to move a character to a location, and willpower. Locations can be challenged. When a location has damage equal to or greater than its willpower, that location is banished. A location may have a lore value, which is how much lore its player gains at the start of their turn during the set step. If a location has an activated ability, that ability can be used the same turn the location comes into play. A player may have multiple copies of a location with the same name in their deck, but they can't have more than 4 copies with the same full name. And so some locations have abilities like they give your character evasive or ward, and those can be used the turn they're played. Next is lore, the resource players race to gain as they play. The first player to reach 20 lore wins the game. Unless they play that new card, I think it's a Scrooge McDuck that says your opponent has to get 25 lore to win. Lore value, which is the little the symbol, a card characteristic that indicates the amount of lore its player can gain from it each turn. If it's a character, the lore is gained by questing. If it's a location, the lore is gained at the start of the player's turn during the set step. Main phase is the second phase of the turn structure, where a player can perform any of the main phase turn actions. See section 4.3, which is main phase. Move cost. So the cost to move one of your characters to one of your locations, and it is on the left side along the classification line where normally you would see the name that has like a little hexagonish symbol with a number in it, and that is the move cost. Multiplayer game is a game played with 3 or more players. Name. A card's name appears in large text above its classification line. On actions, items, and locations, the name is located in the center of the card. On characters, the name is located on the left of the card across from its strength and willpower. A character or location's name and version together make up the card's full name. I feel like we've talked about this in every possible configuration. Opponent. Anyone a player is playing against, also known as opposing player. Opposing character is a character played by an opponent. Opposing player is anyone a player is playing against, also known as opponent. So opponent equals opposing player, and any character they play is an opposing character. Phase, one of the 3 main parts of a turn. The phases of a player's turn are the beginning phase, the main phase, and end of turn phase. Play is the act of playing a card. A card can only be played from a player's hand. If the card played is an action, the player reveals the card, pays its cost, resolves its effects, then discards it. If the player played a character, item, or location, the player reveals the card, pays its cost, and puts that card into play by putting it into the play zone. And a player is anyone that is playing the game. Private zone is a zone where the cards aren't publicly known. Players can't look at them unless directed by a game rule, such as drawing a card or an effect. Players can count the number of cards in the private zone at any time. While a private zone is revealed, it is not considered private. So private zones are like your deck or your inkwell or your hand. And next would be public zone, a zone where the cards are publicly known. Players can look at or count the cards in any public zone at any time. So this would be like the play zone, or your discard is also a public zone. Quest, when a player exerts a character to gain lore equal to the character's lore value. A character can't quest the same turn it's played because it's not dry, it is drying. Ready, a card that has been put up in the ready position, so upright, or the act of putting a card in the ready position. So a card that's been put in the ready position is ready, which I would guess would be an adverb. And then if you're putting the card into the ready position, you're readying the card, that would be a verb. A player readies all of their exerted cards in the ready step of their turn. I think the only time this doesn't happen is if you've been cursed by some sort of Elsa Anna thing, because those have the ability to freeze your character, and they say that like you can't ready at the start of your next turn. Ready step, the first step of the beginning phase of a player's turn where effects that apply during your turn start applying and the active player readies all their cards in play. Effects that would end at the start of your turn or at the start of your next turn end. Effects that trigger at the start of your turn trigger, however, they wait until the set step to start resolving. So for example, Tragic Hero Beast, at the start of your turn, if you have no damage, you can draw a card. So that would trigger. However, you don't draw a card until the set step. Reminder text is the italicized text following a keyword and enclosed in parentheses. It's not rules text and serves only as a memory aid. So it'll be like support. And then in parentheses, it'll say like, when this character quests, you may give its strength to another character. So that would be, the reminder text would be the part in the parentheses. Replacement effect, an effect generated by some static ability that replaces one effect with another. So an example would be like in Bodyguard. Bodyguard has a static effect of when you play this character, you can play it exerted instead of ready. So the playing it exerted is replacing playing it ready. Reveal is showing the face of a card or cards defined in the effect to all players. So for example, you play Diablo, the little green one, then your opponent has to reveal their hand and basically show everybody their hand. Set step, the second step of the beginning phase of a player's turn where characters that are in play are no longer drawing and can quest, challenge, or exert to pay costs for activated abilities or song cards. During this step, the active player gains lore from locations they have in play with a lore characteristic, effects that would occur at the start of your turn or at the beginning of your turn, and abilities that triggered during the ready step are added to the bag. Then all triggers are resolved. Shuffle is randomizing the order of cards in a deck. Simultaneous turns, a turn in some multiplayer formats in which all players on the same team progress through the phases and steps of the game at the same time. Triggered abilities and effects are added to the bag by the team as a whole, and the team chooses the order they resolve in. So kind of like Your entire team in this multiplayer game is like one big person. Song, a type of action that can be played by exerting characters or by paying the song's ink cost. Stack, so stack is both a noun and a verb. So stack as a noun is a number of cards set on top of each other, such as the character was shift and the character it was played onto. When cards in a stack leave play, they all go to the same zone as the top card and are no longer considered to be in a stack. So for example, if you play We Don't Talk About Bruno on a shifted character, you would return all the characters in that stack to the player's hand. So like when it's in the play zone, maybe it's just a Diablo Devoted Herald, but because it was shifted, when you return it to their hand, they now have 2 cards in their hand, so they only discard one of them with the We Don't Talk About Bruno, as opposed to both. And then stack as a verb is when multiple effects combine. So keyword abilities that stack are followed by +N. So it would be like resist stacks and like challenger stacks. Starting hand is the initial 7 cards that a player draws at the start of the game before they choose whether to alter their hand. The starting player is the player who takes the first turn of the game, determined randomly before the game begins. The starting player doesn't draw on that turn. Static ability is an effect that could alter characteristics of a card, game rule, or game state. A static ability is continuously active, either for a fixed length of time or for as long as the card generating the effect is in play. Strength is the amount of damage a character deals in a challenge. A character's strength may be referenced in abilities or effects. Triggered abilities, ability that causes an effect to be added to the bag when a particular condition is met. Triggered abilities start with when, whenever, at the start of, or at the end of, and describe the game state that causes the abilities to trigger and the effects of the abilities. When an ability triggers, its effect is placed into the bag to be resolved. So triggered abilities are the only ones that go into the bag. Turn, the unit of time each player takes to complete the following 3 phases. Beginning phase, main phase, and end of turn phase. Each player takes their turn before passing the turn to the next player. Turn action is an action that the game allows a player to take during the main phase of their turn. A player may take any number of actions during their turn in any order. Turn actions include putting a card in the inkwell, playing a card, questing, challenging, moving a character to a location, and using activated abilities. Version is a descriptor that can differentiate cards with the same name for purposes of building a deck. A character's or location's name and version together will constitute the card's full name. Willpower is how much damage it takes to banish a character or location, and the zone is a physical or non-physical, in the case of the bag, space that is used for gameplay purposes. Whether a zone is public or private determines what information can be shared about the cards there. Each player's zones are deck, which is private, hand, private, play zone, public, inkwell, private, discard, public, and bag, not really, I guess technically public, but not really a real zone. And all zones are considered separate from one another. And that is it for the glossary. So completely done with the comprehensive rules now. Hopefully this was helpful to you guys. It was definitely educational for me. And as always, keep shuffling. Hopefully you don't end up with a whole handful of non-inkables like me. All right, bye.